I love making coats. If you can find some good material for a reasonable price, you can make high quality coats for cheaper than you can buy in the shop. Today I'll show you how to make this ladylike dress coat from McCall's pattern 7442 View C. I'll walk you through all the tough steps like sewing the sleeves, buttonholes and the lining. This pattern is a must-have for everyone who loves well-fitted coats for winter. It looks great over the top of dresses and fits like a dream. Let's get started. Here's the equipment that you'll need to make this classic coat. You'll need at least 2.4 meters of coating material like wool, tweed or velvet. If you intend to wear this for winter, I suggest using a heavy to medium weight wool or wool blend. I'm using a medium weight pure wool fabric which I found secondhand. This coat is only lined to the bodice, so you'll need 1.4 meters of lining material. I'm using Bem silk. You'll also need 1.6 meters of interfacing for the front facing and the collar. You'll need a spool of matching thread. And you'll need 7 buttons with a 2 cm diameter. Lastly, you'll need all the usual sewing supplies like the sewing machine, scissors, pins, tailor's chalk, a measuring tape, an iron and an ironing board. The pattern we're using is McCall's 7442 View C. This pattern has a lot of great options for peplums, hoods and lace decorations which you can add to this coat too. Check the top tab for the size measurements. Choose your size according to your bust and waist measurements. Follow your bust measurement primarily. You'll need basic sewing skills and to be familiar with using patterns. This pattern is an average difficulty, but I'm confident amateur sewers can make this if you follow along with this video. For View C, you need to cut out pattern pieces 1 to 5, 8, 10 to 12, 14, 15, and 17 to 20. When cutting out the pattern, you need to follow the line indicated as your size all the way around the outside of the pattern. Don't cut into the dart markings, which are the triangles on the inside of pattern pieces 1 and 2. You also don't cut along any of the cutting lines inside of the pattern piece. Check back on your pattern sheet for the instructions on how to lay your pattern pieces on top of the fabric. Choose the instructions for your size. If your instructions have fold written on the bottom right, then you need to fold the fabric in half widthwise. And if the pattern pieces are shaded, you need to place them face down on top of the fabric. I'm using the third instructions for coat C because my fabric is wide and I'm making a size 12. Unfortunately, my fabric is 140 centimeters wide instead of 150. So I can't fit all the pattern pieces exactly as shown on the instructions, but I encourage you to follow the instructions to save more fabric than I did. Fold your fabric in half and pin on both sides. We place piece 18 next to the fold of the fabric. You must now align the pattern to the grain of the fabric. Use a measuring tape to measure from the arrow down the middle of the pattern, called the grain line, to the fold of the fabric. Make sure that this length is the same down the length of the arrow. Pin the pattern into place. Place pieces 5, 11, then 4 and make sure that their grain lines are parallel with the fold or the edge of the fabric, then pin. To cut the pieces out, we cut close to the edge of the pattern. Take extra care to cut out the notches, which are the triangle markings at the edge of the pattern piece. To cut the notches, we make a triangle going outwards from the pattern. These are important for aligning the pattern pieces later as we sew. Occasionally you'll see double or triple notches. Cut them in a way that you can tell them apart from single notches. Place piece 10 on the fabric upside down and pin. Piece 2 must be placed on the fold of the fabric. which means you must place the side with the rectangle arrow directly on the fold of the fabric, and you must not cut along this side. This pattern only represents half of the fabric piece, so placing it on the fold creates the complete pattern piece. Pin piece 2 into place and cut around the other 3 sides. Piece 8 and 17 must be placed on the fold as well. Note that piece 17 must be cut out twice. Pin and cut out piece 15 in the leftover fabric above these pieces. Arrange the last few pieces the best you can to save fabric. Piece 3 must be placed on the fold. Time to cut out the lining. Fold the lining fabric in half. Place piece 14 next to the edge, then piece 15 beside it, and align the grain lines with the edges or the fold. For these 2 sleeve pieces, we must cut out the lining shorter than the main fabric. So fold the pattern piece along the cutting line for the lining and pin. When it comes to cutting these pattern pieces out, you must cut next to the fold of the pattern. Next, we cut out piece 19 next to the selvages. We need to sew darts into piece 1 and 2 to help shape the bodice. Here's my easy method for making perfect darts. Pin the pattern to the wrong side of the fabric. Now pin on the inside of the dart marking. This is the triangle in the middle of the pattern. Pull out all the pins which aren't on the inside of the dart. To copy the marking onto the fabric, we fold the pattern piece in half along the line for the dart marking. Carefully draw a line next to the folded pattern. These darts are slightly curved, so try and draw from dot to dot. Do the same for the other side of the pattern. Take off the pattern piece. Pinch the dart markings at the top and the bottom to fold the dart in half. The lines for the darts must match, so what I do is poke a needle through one of the lines and see if it passes out through the other. Pin as you align the 2 dart markings. You need to make darts for both of piece 1 and 2, so there are 4 darts in total. On your sewing machine, sew along the dart marking. Now that you've made the darts, trim off the seam allowance so there's about 1 centimeter left. Finish these raw edges by zigzagging close to the edge or overlocking. Do this individually for each layer and iron the seams open. Take piece 1 and 2 and pin them right sides together at the side seam. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. We need to mark out the triangles at the top corners of piece 3. I normally do this by pinning the pattern to the fabric and folding it along the marking. Then use your tailor's chalk to make the marking onto the fabric. We need to make an easing stitch between these markings and the notch marking on the same edge. Set your sewing machine to straight stitch with as long as possible stitch length. Pull out some of the bobbin and top thread before you sew. Sew at 1 centimeter from the chalk marking to the notch. As you sew, you must not backstitch, and pull out some of the thread once you're done. Now we're going to make the shoulder seam. Grab both of piece 4 and lay them on the table facing up. Place piece 3 on top so that the right sides are together. Pin these pieces together at the top edge with the easing stitch. Grab one of the threads for the easing stitch and gently pull it to shorten this edge. You need to pull the easing stitch just enough so that the raw edge looks slightly wavy and the length is the same as for the corresponding seam on piece 4. Sew these pieces together with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Back to piece 1. Pin the pattern on top of the fabric and mark the small circle at the top next to the notch. The corresponding circle can be found on the bottom corner of piece 4. Mark this circle onto the fabric as well. This circle marks where to stop sewing and helps ease in the sleeve. Note that it is best to make these markings on both the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. The next part is challenging, so take this step by step. Lay out the bottom half of the bodice, which is made of piece 1 and 2. Lay it with right sides facing up. We'll start by attaching piece 3 to piece 2. Lay the bottom edge of piece 3 on the top edge of piece 2 with right sides together and pin. Now angle the fabric slightly so you can lay piece 4 on top of piece 1 with right sides together. Start by pinning the corners of these pieces together and matching the single notch. Then match the chalk marking that you made at the armhole for these two pieces and pin. Now pin the rest of the seam. Use plenty of pins, as piece 1 is curved while piece 4 is not. Repeat for the other side of the bodice. Sew piece 2 and 3 together at 1.5 centimeters. For piece 1 and 4, you need to sew from the corner to the chalk marking that you made. Sew at 1.5 centimeters. As you sew, try and stretch piece 1 slightly so that the curve will fit the straight edge of piece 4. Backstitch over the chalk marking a few times to strengthen it. Split all the seam allowances open for the bodice and iron flat. Finish the raw edges individually for the seams that you've done so far. The exception is the seam for piece 2 and 3, which should be ironed facing down and the raw edges finished together. Your bodice should be looking shapely and neat. Moving on to sewing the skirt for this coat. Grab piece 10, which is the skirt back piece. Pin both of piece 10 with right sides together on the side with the triple notch. Sew at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. This coat isn't lined through the skirt, so we need to neaten the raw edges nicely. I suggest folding the seam allowance in half and zigzag stitching over the top. Zigzag stitch close to the fold and trim away the excess seam allowance. This looks really neat and won't fray. Grab piece 5, which are the pocket pieces that you cut out in the fabric. Pin the right side of the pocket piece to the right side of the back skirt pieces, matching the notch near the top. Sew the pocket pieces in place with a 5mm seam allowance. Sew both of the pocket pieces to the back skirt pieces. Grab piece 11, which is the skirt front piece. Next, grab the pocket piece which you cut out in the lining and pin it to the top notch and sew it into place with a 5mm seam allowance, just as you did before. Grab the pattern for piece 11 and pin it to the wrong side of the fabric. Use your tailor's chalk to copy the 2 big dot markings onto the fabric. Lay piece 11 on top of piece 10. You need to flip out both of the pocket pieces. Pin the pocket pieces together around the curved edge. Then you need to pin the skirt pieces together. You must not sew between the markings that you made for the big dots, so don't pin in this area. Sew around the curve of the pocket until you reach the dot marking. Then turn right and sew down the rest of the skirt. Back to the top of the skirt, sew from the top edge to the dot marking. Make sure that you gently pull the pocket pieces out so that they don't catch in the seam. Use the same technique to finish these seams. Fold the seam allowance in half and zigzag stitch. Pin the top edge of the pocket towards the front of the skirt and sew it 1 centimeter. This won't be seen in the final product. This view of the pattern is a cute peplum frill at the waist, which is made from pieces 8 and 12. Pin both of piece 8 to the straight edge of piece 12 with right sides together. Match the double notch and sew together at 1.5 centimeters. These pieces aren't lined, so once again, finish the raw edges nicely. Zigzag stitch over the longer edge of the peplum. Then sew an easing stitch over the top of this edge at 5 millimeters. Fold up the bottom edge of the peplum by 1.5 centimeters and iron into place. Now you need to fold the raw edge under by 5 millimeters. I suggest starting with piece 8 since the edge is gently curved. For piece 12, start at the edge. Gently pull one of the easing stitches so that the raw edge starts together. Fold the bulk of the raw edge underneath and pin into place. Sew the hem into place at 1 cm and make sure that the raw edge doesn't pop out as you sew. Pull out the easing stitch and you have a peplum. The peplum is attached to the top edge of the skirt. Firstly, we sew around the top edge of the peplum at 1 cm so it won't stretch. Lay out your skirt. Lay the peplum on top of the skirt so that the wrong side of the peplum is on top of the right side of the skirt. Align the side seam of the peplum on top of the side seam of the skirt. Pin the peplum into place. Base stitch the peplum at 1 cm. Now for the exciting part. We're going to sew the skirt and the bodice together. Lay the bodice on top of the skirt with right sides together. We need to align the side seam for the skirt and the bodice. Here's how to get the perfect alignment. Press the seams to be aligned together and measure 1.5 cm from the raw edge. Pinch the pieces together at 1.5 cm, then split the pieces open to view how they'll align. Move the two pieces around until they align perfectly. Sew over the seams to be aligned at 1.5 cm without backstitching, and check that they're aligned nicely. Now that you've aligned the side seams, you need to pin the rest of the bodice and the skirt together. Sew the waist at 1.5 cm. Trim the seam allowance to about half and zigzag over the top. These sleeves are quite challenging because you need to align two seams between the sleeve and the bodice. Grab piece 14. We need to sew an easing stitch on these sleeve pieces between the two notches. I marked these notches with tailor's chalk to make them easier to see. Use the same method for sewing the easing stitch as you did previously for the bodice back. Lay piece 15 on top of piece 14 with right sides together. Pin these two pieces together down the side seams and match the notches. Sew down the side seams with a 1.5 cm seam allowance and finish them with a zigzag stitch. Grab the pattern piece for piece 14 and pin it to the wrong side of the fabric. Copy off all 3 circle markings at the top of this piece. We need to sew 2 easing stitches over all 3 of these markings for both of the sleeves. I suggest sewing the easing stitches at 1 cm and 2 cm. The corresponding circles can be found on piece 3 and 4 of the bodice. Copy these markings onto the fabric as well. The center circle marking on the sleeve corresponds with the shoulder seam of the bodice. Lay out your coat so that it's inside out. Grab your sleeve, which should be the right side out, and place it into the armhole. Make sure that you match the single notch and the double notch for this seam. This will help you check that you have the right sleeve. From there, we need to align the 2 sleeve seams. The side seams of the sleeve need to be aligned with both of the back and front yoke seams of the bodice. Align the sleeve back seam with the yoke seam on the back of the bodice. This was the seam that you left open at the end. The best way to align the seam is to place the end of the bodice back seam directly on top of the sleeve seam to be aligned, and pin. Now align the side front seam of the sleeve with the yoke seam on the front of the bodice. Sew over the seams at 1.5 centimeters and check that they align nicely. Now we need to pin the rest of the sleeve to the armhole. Start by matching the top circle marking on the sleeve with the shoulder seam of the bodice and pin. On each side, you must now pull the easing stitches to make the fabric wavy at the edge, so that you can pin the sleeve to the armhole. The area at 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the sleeve should be smooth. Try and pull the easing stitch closest to the edge more to achieve this. Adjust the easing stitch so that both of the side dots match on the sleeve and the bodice. Remove the attachment on the machine and slide the sleeve into the arm. Sew the sleeve to the armhole with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Do this for both of the sleeves. Pull out the easing stitches once you're done and finish the seams. This coat has a cute Peter Pan collar which is super easy to attach to the coat. Pin the pattern for piece 4 to the coat at the corner for the neckline. Copy the big circle onto the fabric for both sides of the neckline. We need to stay stitch the neckline of this coat. This is where we sew at 1 centimeter from the raw edge to prevent stretching of the neckline in the future. Sew from the chalk marking to the chalk marking all the way around the neckline with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Grab the collar pieces, which is piece 17. Place them so that they are both right sides together and pin around the curved edge. Now sew these two pieces together by the curved edge at 1.5 centimeters. I suggest sewing this seam a second time with a seam allowance of 1.3 centimeters. Trim the seam allowance to about half. Now cut small triangles into the seam allowance for the entire seam. Cut as close as possible to the second seam, but make sure that you don't cut into the sewing. These clippings create a smooth curve for the collar. The second seam which you sewed into the seam allowance prevents the clippings from fraying the fabric. Finish the seam. Turn the collar right side out and iron the curve smooth. Pin the remaining raw edges and sew over it at 1 cm to hold it in place. Lay out the neckline of the coat. Lay the collar on top of the coat with the raw edges together. The corner of the collar needs to align with the chalk marking that you made earlier. Now pin the rest of the collar to the neckline. Try and stretch the collar around the curve and check that it looks smooth underneath. Sew the collar into place with a 1 cm seam allowance. Now the coat's ready for the lining. The facing for the opening of this coat is made from piece 18. Mark the big circle on the side with your tailor's chalk. You need to sew an easing stitch between this marking and the notch above it, which I've also marked with tailor's chalk. Sew the easing stitch at 1 cm just like you did for the shoulder seam. Sew the dart onto both of piece 19 using the same method as you did for piece 2. Trim away the excess fabric and finish the edges once you're done. Mark the large dot marking at the corner of piece 19. The matching dot marking is the one you previously marked on piece 18. You also need to sew the dart marking again into the lining for piece 2. Go ahead and lay out piece 18, which you previously sewed easing stitches down the side. With right sides together, lay piece 19 on top of piece 18 and match the chalk markings that you made for the big circles. Lightly pull the easing stitch on piece 18 so that you can pin the rest of piece 19 down. Sew these two pieces together with a 1.5 cm seam. You need to sew from the top edge and finish on top of the chalk marking, and backstitch over the chalk marking to hold it firm. Zigzag the raw edges separately. Do this for both of piece 18. Below the seam you just sewed, you now need to fold back the raw edge on piece 18 by 1.5 centimeters. Then roll away the raw edge by about 5 mm to make a nice smooth finish. Do this for both of piece 18. Sew over this hem at 1 cm to hold it into place. Pin the top edge of piece 2 to the lower edge of piece 3 with right sides together. Sew with the normal seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. Lay down piece 2 and 3 so that the right sides are facing up, using the easing stitch to adjust the width of piece 3 to match piece 19. Pin these pieces right sides together at the shoulder seam. Pin together at the side seams too and match the single notch. Sew these seams together at 1.5 centimeters. Zigzag stitch the seams individually, except the back yoke seam where the raw edges are sewn together. The lining for the sleeves are sewn in much the same way as you previously did for the fabric. Sew an easing stitch between the two notches on both of piece 14. Mark the 3 dot markings at the top edge of piece 14, just like you did with the main fabric. Sew 2 easing stitches over these dot markings. Sew piece 14 and 15 right sides together using the easing stitch to adjust the length of piece 14 to fit piece 15. Finish the raw edges. Pull the sleeve the right way out and place it into the armhole using the 2 notch markings to guide you. For the sleeve lining, we only need to align the back side seam of the sleeve with the yoke seam on the back of the bodice. This is challenging since they are both angled seams. I suggest marking 1.5 centimeters with your tailor's chalk and moving the seam around until they align nicely. Pin the rest of the sleeve to the armhole. Match the shoulder seam to the top dot marking and pull the easing stitch so that the sleeve will fit into the armhole, just as you did for the main fabric. Try to match the dot markings on the sides too. Sew the sleeves to the armhole at 1.5 centimeters. The lining is all sewn up, so we can now attach it to the rest of the coat. Lay out the coat so that it is facing the right way out. Turn the lining inside out and lay it on top of the main coat with right sides together. We'll start by matching the necklines. Place the corner of the neckline for the lining on top of the same corner for the main fabric. Make sure that the collar isn't in the way of the raw edges. Pin the lining to the coat all the way around the neckline. Rotate the coat so that you're now viewing piece 18 of the lining on top of the front opening of the coat. Pin down the length of piece 18. The bottom corner of piece 18 should match the bottom corner of the skirt. Do this for piece 18 on the other side of the coat too. Sew the lining to the coat at 1.5 centimeters along the raw edges that you've pinned. Trim away the seam allowance for this seam to about half. Carefully clip off all the seam allowance at the corner, but don't cut into your sewing. Next, we need to understitch the lining. This means that we're going to sew the seam allowance towards the lining side of the seam that you just did. Understitching helps prevent the facing from showing when you wear the coat and creates a crisp edge. Spread out the seam and press the seam allowance so that it's laying on the facing side of the coat. Pin the seam allowance to the facing all the way around the front opening and the neckline. Move the coat into the sewing machine so that the foot is now hovering over the facing side of the seam. Position the foot so that you can now sew about 5 millimeters from the seam on the facing side. As you sew, check that the seam allowance is being sewn down. Sew all the way around the facing. We're now going to sew the raw edge of the lining down onto the seam allowance for the waist. Finish the lower edge of the lining. Use your iron to turn up 1.5 centimeters from the lower edge on the wrong side of the fabric. Lay this fold down on the seam that you did for the waist. Both of the seam allowances should be facing up so that they're enclosed by the lining. Arrange the lining on the seam so that the side seams are aligned, then pin it into place. Make sure that the facing is lying flat by pinning it into place. I'm going to do an invisible ladder stitch to sew the lining down, and here's how I suggest doing it. We'll start sewing at the corner where the facing meets the lining. Thread your needle and knot to make a double thread. Knot your thread into the corner and tack the stitching into place. To make your first stitch, you need to push the needle into the seam allowance of the waist about 0.5 centimeter. Try to make the stitch as close as possible to the waist seam. Check that the needle isn't piercing the right side of the coat before pulling through. Now we make the stitch into the lining. You need to insert the needle into the lining seam at the same spot that you exited the seam allowance. Make a stitch length of about 0.5 centimeter. Make the next stitch into the seam allowance of the coat just like before. This method creates small vertical stitches which are nearly invisible. Keep sewing until you reach the end of the lining, then knot off. Great, the lining is all done, so it's time to hem the coat. This coat has a hem of 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. We need to do a few steps to prepare. Fold the facing back down on the skirt and pin. Chalk out a line 2.5 centimeters from the bottom edge of the facing. Sew the facing to the skirt at 2.5 centimeters using the chalk marking to guide you. Do this for the bottom of both facings. Trim away the seam allowance for this seam to about 1 centimeter, but don't trim any further than this for the skirt. Clip off all the seam allowance at the corner like so. Finish all the raw edges at the bottom of the skirt. On the wrong side of the coat, pin up the lower edge of the skirt by 2.5 centimeters and pin into place. Sew about 5 millimeters from the edge. Now we roll under the raw edge of the hem by 5 millimeters. Now sew at a seam allowance of 2 centimeters from the edge. This seam should catch the edge of the hem and hold it into place. On the right side you'll have 2 nice parallel seams. We also need to hem the sleeves of this coat. Fold up the raw edge of the sleeve on the inside by 4 centimeters. Do this for both sleeves. Pull the sleeve lining through the sleeve and make sure that it's not twisted on the inside. Fold up the raw edge of the lining by 1.5 centimeters on the wrong side. This is the side facing outwards. You must now place the fold of the lining so that it's 1.5 centimeters away from the edge of the sleeve. Make sure that you align the seams of the lining on top of the same seam for the main sleeve. Pin all the way around the lining. I'm going to sew the lining into place with a ladder stitch, which we previously used to sew the lining to the waist. Knot your thread into the lining. Make a horizontal stitch into the hem of the sleeve for about 1/2 centimeter. Make sure that the needle isn't showing on the right side of the fabric, then pull through. Make the next stitch into the fold of the lining directly above where you finished the previous stitch. Continue the ladder stitch all the way around the sleeve lining. Don't forget to stitch the other sleeve too. We need to sew buttonholes on the left-hand side of the coat opening, and we'll sew the buttons on the right-hand side. Luckily, this pattern comes with a really handy guide for making buttonhole markings in the form of piece 20. We pin piece 20 to the left side of the coat. The big dot marks the top edge of the pattern. Place this end of the pattern flush against the corner of the base of the collar and start pinning down the length. Pin underneath the buttonhole markings. Pull out the excess pins so you can fold the pattern along the buttonhole marking. Copy the marking onto the fabric by making a sideways T marking. Make all 7 buttonhole markings. Time to start sewing the buttonholes. Set up your sewing machine to do a buttonhole. Most modern machines are automatic, but have a good read of your instruction manual. For most machines, you need to do these steps. Load your button into the foot and load the buttonhole foot into the machine. Pull down the tab at the side to guide the foot. Change your machine to the buttonhole mode and lower the stitch length to about 1. Remember that after each buttonhole you need to switch the buttonhole mode off and on again to restart the sequence. Test the buttonhole out with a scrap piece of fabric before you do your real buttonholes. On the coat, place the buttonhole foot so that the needle is facing towards the edge of the fabric. The marking for the end of the buttonhole must be inside of the space for the needle, with the lines aligned directly in the middle. Time to sew those buttonholes. This time we need to pin the buttonhole guide to the right hand side of the coat and copy off the button markings. These are the crosses on top of the buttonhole markings. Fold back the pattern and make a cross marking onto your fabric for each button. Thread your needle with a double thread and knot it. Push the needle into the facing side of the fabric and through the button marking. Pass the needle through the wrong side of the button and then through the right side of the opposite hole. Push the needle through the fabric so that you make a small loop. Keep repeating this action so that you build up some thread on the button. As you sew, you need to make sure that the loop leaves some space in between the button and the fabric. I usually hover the button on top of the fabric, but you can also create a platform for the button using cardboard. Create another loop for the other holes on the button on top. Once you've built up enough thread to make a strong loop, you need to create a shank. We loop the thread around the button, pass the needle through the loop, then pull tight. Do this a few times. This ties the stack of threads on the button together and strengthens it. And knot off strongly. Sew all 7 buttons onto the markings that you made. And we're done! Today we learned how to make a beautiful wool coat. This coat will keep you warm and elegant all winter. Trust me, once you get the hang of sewing coats, you'll be making them all the time. They're fun and rewarding to sew. Thanks for watching. Next up in our pattern tutorial series, I'll be showing you how to make a 1950s dress. This is a vintage reproduction dress pattern with an inbuilt petticoat. This will be a must-see tutorial for everyone who loves vintage dresses.